You are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Today's section, I quickly run with you the arterial anastomosis around the scapula. My friends, there are so many arterial anastomosis or anastomotic connections in the human body. Yes, what they do is that they are life-saving. They provide, alternative or collateral, blood supply in case there's any kind of obstruction, to any of the participating anastomotic, arterial branches. Now, one important thing is that specifically for the scapular anastomosis, it is very important because it will allow blood to flow, around the scapula. Not only that, the shoulder joints. And of course, if from the shoulder, then of course we know that the arm, of the upper limb will also receive that blood supply in case there's any injury or occlusion, to any of the participating vessels. For instance, if there is occlusion to the subclavian artery because of this rich anastomotic connection, yes, it will prevent that kind of, avascular necrosis happening to any of the participating structures. And that goes on to explain the reason why the scapula specifically is one bone which, yes, resists, to a very large extent, avascular necrosis. That is an important thing. Now you get to know that specifically this anastomotic connection will be mainly between the branches of what we call the first part of the subclavian artery and of course the third part of the axillary artery. So my friends, if you've not watched the whole complete picture of the subclavian artery and of course the axillary artery, I will encourage you so that you do that. And so without much ado, let's set the ball rolling, looking at what I have for you today. So there we are, my friends. Before I go to this main arterial anastomosis, what will happen is that I want to just quickly, take you through some bits. It's not going to be so detailed, but take you through some bit of what we call the, subclavian artery and of course the axillary artery. Yes, my friends, everyone knows that, yes, from the arch of the aorta, we know that three branches normally will arise. And what are these three branches? We talk about, yes, from right to left, we talk about the brachiocephalic trunk. Then we talk about the left, common carotid artery, and of course, left subclavian artery. My friends, I'm not interested in all those guys, but what I'm interested in is that if you look at the brachiocephalic trunk, yes, what will happen is that, yes, if it's the right branches by way of the right common carotid artery, and then the right, subclavian artery, we know they will be coming as branches from what we call the brachiocephalic trunk. My friends, I'm more interested in the subclavian artery. I won't go into nitty-gritty, but one thing I see is that this subclavian artery anatomically is divided into three parts. And what are these three parts? The first part, which otherwise we want to call it, pre-scalene part, or the proximal part. And then of course I have the one which is deep to a muscle, that muscle is actually scalenus anterior muscle. So with the help of a muscle which we call the scalenus anterior muscle or the anterior scalene muscle, which runs, superficial to the second part of the axillary artery, and therefore we call the second part of the axillary artery the deep part, or what we call the retroscalene part behind the scalenus anterior muscle, and then of course the third part being the lateral part, otherwise what we call the postscalene part. So that is how we describe this kind of subclavian artery. Now one thing that we know is that I've given you that mnemonic already, that if you want to know the branches of this subclavian artery, there's this simple mnemonic for you, and that mnemonic is vitamin CD. Vitamin CD. And my friends, the first part of the subclavian artery will give off three branches. That's the first VIT of the vitamin. VIT, and V represent what we call the vertebral artery, which ascends upwards, going through the transverse foramina of the upper 6 cervical vertebrae. It means that C7 doesn't have transverse foramen transversarum, or even if it has, it's so small for this vertebral artery to run through it, and that is why to go through only the upper 6, C1 to C6, transverse foramina. So that is what we see. Okay, so that's the vertebral artery. I'm not more interested in that, but again, I also have under artery. I told that vitamin V for vertebral artery, I for internal thoracic artery. Yes, internal thoracic artery, which otherwise you want to call it internal mammary artery, one of the main supply to the mammary gland. Yes, that's why we call it internal mammary artery. Okay, so this guy over here, yes, it goes deep to the thoracic cage, okay, to go and supply those areas. Okay, so this is what we call the internal thoracic artery. And of course, that one is going downwards, and immediately the one opposite to it, above it, okay, is a trunk, and that trunk is what we call the thyrocervical trunk. Thyrocervical trunk. My friends, this guy, thyrocervical trunk, also gives off 3 branches. And what are these 3 main branches? Generally, it gives off the sit branches. I've told you already, the sit is for suprascapular artery. So this artery over here is coming from the first part of the axillary artery indirectly, but it's coming from what we call the thyrocervical trunk. This is what we call suprascapular artery. Then I is for what we call, inferior thyroid artery. So an artery will be ascended upwards. I for inferior thyroid artery. Okay, of course, we know that inferior thyroid artery also give off a branch which ascends upwards as ascending cervical artery. Okay, I'm not interested in that one. Yes, in the neck region, so it's moving upwards in the neck region, so we call it ascending cervical artery. My friends, one important thing that we know is that this transverse cervical artery, more importantly, this transverse cervical artery, where the third part of told the sit, okay, branches. The transverse cervical artery will give off 2 branches. One is a superficial branch and one is a deep branch. My friends, that deep branch of the transverse cervical artery can also be called a dorsal scapular artery. Dorsal scapular artery. Okay, and the reason why we are calling it dorsal scapular artery, because yes, although it's run along the medial border of the scapula, it's actually more toward the dorsal surface. Okay, so that's why we may also call the deep branch of the transverse cervical artery the dorsal scapular artery. Okay, so that is one thing that we find over here. Okay, now so these are the branches that I want you to know in the first part of the, subclavian artery. I told you that this rich anastomotic connection around the scapula mainly, yes, is by the courtesy of the first part of the subclavian artery. Yes, taking away the vertebral artery, taking away, of course, internal thoracic artery. So it means that the one I'm interested in the first part of the axillary artery is which guy? Is this guy over here, which you call the thyrocervical trunk. Okay, and even with the thyrocervical trunk, which ones are of immense importance? I don't need the inferior thyroid artery, but what I need is that I need the suprascapular artery and of course the transverse cervical artery. Yes, the deep part of the subclavian artery, where is number 2 over here. Yes, it gives off a single branch. And what is the name of that single branch? Over there is a trunk, costocervical trunk. Yes, I'm not interested in that one because I'm not going to participate in this rich anastomotic connection. Now over here, you see the third part of the axillary artery is no branch has been shown over here. But my friends, yes, there could be a branch coming from it. And I told you that is vitamin C. The C is for the second part. A branch is coming from the second part, which is the costocervical trunk. And then D for the third part, which is the dorsal scapular artery. Now, my friend, don't be confused over there because I've mentioned the dorsal scapular artery, that it is synonymous to the deep branch of the transverse cervical artery. Yes, it could be coming from this transverse cervical artery only. But in case it doesn't come from the transverse cervical artery, then it will be coming, okay, independently from what we call the third part of the axillary artery, the dorsal scapular artery. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. There could be these kind of anatomical variations. So my friends, as far as the subclavian artery is concerned, what is of immense importance for you is that this guy over here, where the costocervical trunk from the first part of the subclavian artery, yes, giving off 3 branches. Okay, I told the sit branches, but the sit, I'm interested in the suprascapular. I don't need the inferior thyroid. Okay, yes, but the next one I need is the T, is the transverse cervical artery. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. Yes, so moving away from that, then I have to also quickly take you through what we call the axillary artery. My friends, yes, one thing that we know, okay, is that the subclavian artery from the origin, whether it's coming from the arch of aorta by way of the left subclavian artery, or it's coming from the brachiocephalic trunk by way of the right subclavian artery, yes, where will it end? Yes, it will end at the level, okay, of the lateral border of the first rib. Okay, so beyond the lateral border of the first rib, the name of the artery will change. It is no longer going to be called subclavian artery, but rather call it the axillary artery. we rather call it the axillary artery. And the axillary artery will end where? It will end at the level, okay, of the lower border of this muscle over here, the teres major muscle. Okay, so that is, one thing that we have to know. Now, this axillary artery is also divided into 3 parts. My friends, it's also divided into 3 parts, and these 3 parts, yes, is with the help of another muscle. I told you that the 3 part of the subclavian artery was the help of a muscle, and the name of that muscle was, of course, the scalenus anterior muscle. So the same way, this axillary artery, okay, from the level of what we call the outer border of the first rib, okay, till this muscle, okay, till the the medial border of this muscle. And which muscle are we talking about? This muscle is what we call the pectoralis minor muscle. Pectoralis minor muscle, okay. And so from the beginning of this artery, from the lateral border of the outer from the outer border of the first rib till the lateral border of pectoralis minor muscle, we have the first part of this artery. Then that portion, or we can call the medial part, or the this is the pectoralis minor muscle, okay. Then we also have the deep part, okay, the one where is deep to the muscle, okay, where it could be the retro part, okay, the one deep toward that second part of the axillary artery. And then from the lateral border of the pectoralis minor muscle, okay, till the lateral or the outer border of what we call the teres major muscle, I have what we call the 3rd part of the axillary artery. And my friends, you know the mnemonic already. Yes, we talk about, we say the first part is having a branch, second part is having 2 branches, third part is having 3 branches. And simply with the mnemonic hotel spa, we should be able to tell all these branches. And hotel, the H over there is for highest, okay, highest thoracic artery, which otherwise we want to call it the superior, okay, thoracic artery. So either you say highest or superior thoracic artery. Yes, it's from a higher portion, okay, and it will go downwards along, of course, the medial border of the teres minor muscle, okay. So that's what we find, okay. This guy over here is the superior or the highest thoracic artery. Then I told that it is called hotel spa. And my friends, the other thing is that the next one, okay, tail, okay, the T is for this artery over here, which we call it thoracoacromial artery, otherwise what we call acromial thoracic artery, okay. This guy over here is actually a trunk, let me say that, because at the end of the day it's going to give off 3 major branches, and you know the branches already, the A, P, C, D branches, and the A is for what we call the acromial branch, P is for, of course, the pectoral branch, and of course I say C is for clavicular branch, and of course the D is for the deltoid branch, okay. So that's the APCD branches coming from the thoracoacromial trunk, okay. So that's what we see. Yes, it's coming is from the, with respect to, of course, the pectoralis minor muscle, yes, emerging from the medial border and running on top of it, okay. That's what we see. Then the other one, which runs along the outer border or the lateral border of the pectoralis minor muscle, is this guy over here, okay, is the lateral thoracic artery. Yes, the name tells you itself. It's running along the lateral border of pectoralis minor muscle. Yes, in the thoracic region. So lateral border of what we call the lateral thoracic artery, okay. So I told you is hotel spa. H is for the highest or supreme thoracic artery, first part. Second part is having 2 branches. And what are these 2 branches? The 2 branches are what we call the thoracoacromial artery, and of course the other one is called lateral thoracic artery. Yes, simply with the mnemonic hotel, okay. So T is for the thoracoacromial and L is for the lateral thoracic artery. Then I told the spa, yes, it means the 3rd part is giving off 3 branches, and the spa, S is for this guy. The S is the largest branch of the 3rd part, okay, and that first branch is what we call the subscapular artery. Because yes, one thing that we know is that although yes, it's run along the lateral border of the scapula, what will happen is that it's more related, okay, to what we call the subscapular fossa, okay. So that is why we call the subscapular artery. And my friends, one thing we know is that the subscapular artery, which is yes going to also participate in the arterial anastomosis in the scapular region, is this guy over here, who is the circumflex scapular artery. I'll show you that one. Okay, so that's what we see. And the terminal continuation of this subscapular artery is what we call the thoracodorsal artery. And my friend, the thoracodorsal artery, you know that it runs along a nerve, and that nerve is what we call thoracodorsal nerve, which otherwise known as the nerve to latissimus dorsi. Because so it means that this artery, with the thoracodorsal artery, yes, it's also going to supply this latissimus dorsi we are talking about. And of course, there are two circumflex humeral arteries. One runs anteriorly and the other runs, posteriorly. Okay, so that is what we see. Yes, running around what we call the cervical neck of the humerus. Okay, so that is what we find over here. Okay, so I believe that we've been able to go through this, and it means that we are really set, okay, for us to go through what we call the arterial anastomotic connection, yes, around the scapula. And so that's what we have. So this is a simple schematic representation of the arterial anastomotic connection around the scapula. The reason why the scapula, yes, really doesn't suffer from, avascular necrosis. And the reason is simple because, yes, mainly by way of some branches coming from what we call the first part of the subclavian artery, okay? Yes, I'm going to find some other things, and then the other one mainly coming from what we call the third part of the axillary artery. We are going to produce this rich anastomotic connection, which is schematically shown over here. And what are we talking about? I told you that from the first part of the axillary artery, there was this important branch over here. And what was the name of that branch? That was the thyrocervical trunk. And this thyrocervical trunk, with the short axis over here, will give off some branches. I told you that the first branch, which is of importance, I told that it will give 6 branches, and the 6 S is for suprascapular artery. So my friends, you see this guy over here, this is the suprascapular artery. Now the scapula that is shown over here, we are looking at a dorsal aspect of the scapula. The reason is simple because I see this is the medial border, there's a lateral border, yes, and of course the reason why it is dorsal, yes, is that this spine over here, so that we have this large infraspinal fossa and then the small supraspinal fossa can be seen. And this guy, who is the spine, projects superlaterally to become the acromion of the scapula. So I know I'm looking at the dorsal aspect of the scapula. Okay, so this guy over here with the suprascapular artery coming from the thyrocervical trunk of the first part of the subclavian artery. Okay, I see it running. Okay, from where? It's running, going through that kind of, it's running above. Okay, that fossa, foramen, which will be created over here by the bridging, okay, of this notch over here by what we call the suprascapular ligament, or the transverse scapular ligament. Yes, that ligament, so that it runs above it. Now I told you about this relation, that an artery will run above that ligament, while of course the nerve will run through the foramen created over there. So it will run over there, yes. And then what is it doing? It will also come. This is not a very good schematic representation, because at the end I'll show you another image. Yes, they will has to run all over this way, going through what we call the spinal glenoidal notch, so that at the end of the day, this artery doesn't supply only the supraspinal tooth muscle, but also it will run through the spinal glenoidal notch to come and supply the infraspinal tooth muscle. Okay, that is what we find. Okay, now that is an important bit of information you should know about that. Okay, this is the suprascapular artery. Now, one thing that we find is that, yes, also from the first part of the subclavian artery, okay, from the thyrocervical trunk again, yes, this time the transverse, the transverse cervical artery, yes, will also divide into 2, giving off a superficial branch and a deep branch. My friends, I told you that that deep branch can also be called a dorsal scapular artery, because, yes, it is run all the way along the medial border, but it's more closer to the dorsal aspect of the scapula. Okay, so it runs along the medial border of the scapula, and my friends, it is also coming downwards all the way till what we call the inferior angle of the scapula. Please get to know these relations very importantly. My friends, as it runs along the medial border of the scapula, it gives off these branches, okay, from it. And these branches, yes, will not only run along the dorsal surface of the scapula, but also will also run along the ventral surface of the scapula. Okay, so please get to know that. My friends, some of these branches from the deep part of the transverse cervical artery or the dorsal scapular artery, what will happen is that they don't only get to the scapula, but some of them also form anastomotic connections with what we call the posterior intercostal arteries around there. And these posterior intercostal arteries, yes, they are mainly coming from, of course, the descendant thoracic aorta. Please get to know that. Okay, so that is an important bit of information over there. Now, the next, so what have we seen? We've seen all these are the branches mainly coming from what we call the first part of the axillary artery. So the first part of the subclavian artery, so just know them: suprascapular artery, and of course the deep part of what we call the transverse cervical artery, otherwise what we call the dorsal scapular artery, giving off branches to, of course, going in the direction toward the medial border of the scapula, not only to the dorsal aspect but also to the ventral aspect. Okay, and not only to this area, to the medial border of the scapula, but also to external aspect laterally, so that it's anastomosis. It's the anastomotic connection is also formed with what we call the posterior intercostal arteries. That's an important thing we should know. So that's one thing we should know. Now the next thing that we also want to know is that this time, what did I say? I said from the third part of the axillary artery. So I'm interested in the spur of the axillary artery. The third part of the axillary artery, we see this artery coming downwards. I told you is the largest artery. The largest artery, okay, that we find over here is what we call the subscapular artery. My friends, the subscapular artery, yes, will run, yes, along the lateral border of the scapula, okay, till the inferior angle of the scapula. Please get to know where they are reaching, till the inferior angle of the scapula over here. Okay, so that's one important thing. Now, what is it doing as it comes over there? Yes, we are calling the subscapular artery because, yes, it's more towards the subscapular fossa. So subscapular artery, it gives off a branch, okay, to also go to the dorsal aspect, contributing to the anastomotic connection. And this branch is the circumflex scapular artery. Circumflex scapular artery. Okay, that is one thing you should know. Okay, that's an important thing. And then one other minor thing that we should know, yes, I told you about the anterior circumflex and of course the posterior circumflex humeral arteries. One important thing that I want you to know over here is that from the posterior circumflex humeral artery, there will be an artery which ascends upwards all the way to the acromion of the scapula. My friends, the name of this artery, okay, yes, you can call it what we call the acromial branch of what we call the posterior circumflex humeral artery. Okay, so that is one important thing we should know. Then the other thing which we should also know about it is that as the suprascapular artery, yes, comes to the supraspinous fossa and eventually to what we call the infraspinous fossa, it gives off a branch. That branch also goes to the acromion, and that is why we also call this one the acromial branch of what we call the suprascapular artery. Okay, now there will be another branch, okay, which is also going to the acromion only, and that is the one we know. This guy is not coming from what we call the third part of the axillary artery, although it's coming from the axillary artery. This time around, it's coming from the second part of the axillary artery. Please get to know that it is from the second part of the axillary artery. Now I told you that this anastomotic connection is mainly between the first part of the subclavian artery and the third part of the axillary artery, but also from the second part of the axillary artery, yes, I see one important trunk, and that is the thoracoacromial artery or the acromiothoracic artery. This artery gives off 4 branches, the APCD branches. Yes, A for what we call acromial, P for pectoral, yes, C for clavicular, and D is for deltoid. I'm talking about the A. The A over here is going to this guy over here. There is the acromial, and that's the acromial branch of what we call the thoracoacromial trunk. Very important over here. So it means that this guy is also receiving 3 acromial branches over here, the acromial only. Please, do you get what we are saying? That is essential what we have to understand over here. All right, so what are we seeing? What are we seeing now? One thing that I want to tell you is that if you look at the lateral border of the scapula, especially towards the dorsal aspect, you see that it is grooved. It is grooved because of this artery over here, which is of course the circumflex scapular artery. So now let's look at the anastomotic connection. The anastomotic connection, yes, what do we see? We see that from a deep branch of the transverse cervical artery or the dorsal scapular artery, yes, we see those branches coming there, and those rich branches are going not only to the supraspinous fossa region, but also to the infraspinous fossa region. And they will form rich anastomotic connection with who? With the suprascapular artery alongside the subscapular artery. So that's one important anastomotic connection that we should know. Now again, from the deep branch of the transverse cervical artery, yes, the inferior angle, yes, will form a rich anastomotic connection over here with, of course, the subscapular artery. So that's one important thing we should know. And then of course, from the various acromial branches, acromial branch of the suprascapular artery, from the thoracoacromial artery and of course the posterior circumflex humeral artery, they also form a rich anastomotic connection around the acromion of the scapula. Okay, so that is one important thing we should know. Yes, not only that, one other thing that we should also know is that from the posterior intercostal arteries, okay, from a deep branch of the transverse cervical artery, yes, will also be anastomotic connection also formed over there. Okay, and of course we know that around the surgical neck of the humerus, yes, of course this loop, okay, between the anterior circumflex and of course posterior circumflex humeral arteries will be formed. Okay, so that is one important thing we should know. A very simple thing that we have to understand over here. So there we are. Now if you look at the scapula, can you see that kind of rich anastomotic connection that we find over here? This guy that we find over here, if you know the name, yes, of course, that's the deep branch of the transverse scapular artery coming downwards along the dorsal the dorsal aspect of the scapula, the medial border of the scapula, actually, the dorsally. Okay. So that is the deep branch of dorsal scapular artery going downwards to form a rich anastomotic connection. Yes, with who? With this guy, which is the subscapular artery, along where we have the inferior angle of the scapula. Then, of course, we know that from the subscapular artery, the circumflex scapular artery runs along the dorsal aspect of the scapula. Yes, coming over here, contributing to the rich anastomotic connection over here with who? With the deep branches coming from the deep part of the transverse cervical artery. Okay, and not only that, from what we call the various branches that will be coming from the suprascapular artery. Now I told that the suprascapular artery will run on top of this ligament over here, which we call the superior transverse scapular ligament, or what we call suprascapular ligament. Okay, so it will run on top of it, then it will run through a groove, okay, that groove between the spine of the scapula and the glenoid cavity, the margin over there. That's why we call it spinal glenoidal notch. It will come and then of course contribute to this rich anastomotic connection over here. Okay, so that is what we see. I told you that there will be that kind of acromial branches from the suprascapular artery. Yes, not only that, from the posterior circumflex humeral artery. Yes, alongside all those ones from the second part of the axillary artery, which of course that's the thoracoacromial trunk, the acromial branch, will all come and form this rich anastomotic connection over here. Okay, so that is an important thing that I want you to know. And so simply put, what have you seen? Then I told you that from the posterior, these are the intercostal spaces in between the ribs at the posterior aspect. Okay, coming from the descending thoracic aorta, I see that there will be some kind of posterior intercostal arteries which will form that anastomotic connection with some branches of the deep part of the transverse cervical artery. Okay, so that is what we see. I also told you that this posterior and anterior circumflex humeral arteries will also form a loop around the surgical neck of the humerus, okay, over here, to give that kind of rich supply to the neck of the humerus. So my friends, that is why the scapula, yes, will actually not suffer, okay, from avascular necrosis. So that there is that kind of collateral, okay, blood supply, alternative route of blood supply in case the subclavian artery branches are obstructed. Yes, there will still be some blood supply to the scapula, not only that to the shoulder joint, and also, yes, for that matter, towards the arm. I hope you find this meeting helpful. I'm very grateful for your time this evening. Have a good night, all of you, and may the good Lord richly bless you. Amen.